Nikolay Trubetskoy was a Russian linguist who left Russia after the Russian Revolution and became a professor in Vienna. And he was motivated by concerns similar to those of Danilevsky, namely the way that people in Europe tended to look down on Russia as backward and inferior, and also the way that people within Russia effectively absorbed the same ideas by seeing themselves as lagging behind Europe and needing to catch up with Europe, become more like the rest of Europe. And although he didn't particularly quote these other civilization theorists that we'll be talking about, he had similar ideas in that he argued that civilizations are each a thing in their own right. And civilizations are not inferior or superior, they're just different. And furthermore, Russia is part of a different civilization from that of Europe and the West. So Russia should not be trying to catch up with the West, it should be following its own destiny. And people in Europe should not see Russia as backward and inferior just because it is different from, what happens in Europe. And he referred to the European civilization as the Romano-Germanic civilization. So, he was a linguist. So he was thinking of the Romance languages spoken in places like France and Italy, and the Germanic, or the countries with the Germanic languages like Germany and England. So Romano-Germanic, but Western European or Western civilization. And he said that what happens, and is kind of a natural human reaction, is that when people encounter another group speaking a foreign language, they can't understand it. To them, it sounds just like babble, meaningless babble. So they think it is meaningless. At least subconsciously. These people speaking this foreign language, we don't know what they're saying, but it sounds meaningless to us. Well, it is probably meaningless what they're saying. And so then it tends to result in thinking that those people speaking that foreign language are inferior. We can't understand them, they can't understand us. We're speaking plain English, but they don't seem to understand what we're saying. They're obviously, inferior to us. This kind of, as I say, a sort of natural human reaction. And he says the same thing happens with the Romano-Germanic civilization when it encounters foreign cultures and civilizations. That, again, it doesn't understand the cultural practices of other people because they're not like their own. So they think that those cultural practices, civilizational values and attitudes are just meaningless. And they therefore think that those other civilizations are inferior. And so this results in people in the West looking down on other civilizations. And he says that the further problem is that those other civilizations tend to adopt Western culture and they end up thinking of themselves as inferior. So there's sort of two aspects to that. When another civilization adopts Western culture, it also absorbs the idea of its own inferiority. So in absorbing Western ideas, because a big part of Western ideas is that Western ways are the best and anything that deviates from that is inferior, they also absorb that idea as well, which underpins a lot of Western thinking. And furthermore, their further development contains elements of their own civilization. So even after they've adopted Western ways, their development contains non-Western elements. So if a civilization that has partly adopted Western culture, Western technologies, Western ideas, then develops, it will be based partly on the Western ways, but also partly on its own values and practices. And to the extent that, say, 80% of development is based on Western and 20% is of its own civilization, it will seem to the West anyway, and maybe to the people in the society itself, that they've only made 80% progress compared to the West, which is 100% Western in progress in the same time. And he says that civilizations, the other civilizations, are in a trap because they can't really fail to adopt Western culture, because they either adopt Western culture because they like Western culture, they admire it and they want to imitate it. They see, the technologies and so on, they want the same. So for that reason, they're going to adopt Western culture, and it leads them into this trap. Or they might want to resist the West, but in resisting the West, they have to fight the West on its own turf, and therefore have to adopt Western practices for that reason as well. So, for example, if you've got the West coming at you with guns, then you need guns to fight back against it. And it's not just the guns, but you also need the commercial and industrial practices that produce guns, so that to give you them to fight the West. So you end up having to adopt not just the guns, but the whole practices that are Western that produce this Western technology of guns. So again, you're led into these traps. And I say guns because that's an important part of how the West dominated the world, as identified by Jared Diamond in his book Guns, Germs and Steel. Trubetskoy argues against what Westerners might have said in the time, again, that he was working in the early 20th century, that they said, well, look, of course Western civilization is superior, because look, we dominate the world, we rule all these countries, we have these colonial empires, so we're obviously more accomplished than other people. He said, well, actually, if you look through history, it's very often the case that it's barbarians who conquer civilizations. So it's the less sophisticated people who conquer the more sophisticated people. So the fact that the West has conquered all these places doesn't mean it's more sophisticated. It doesn't mean it's superior. So he would say that Western dominance is not equal to, doesn't mean that it is superior. And another point he makes is that the forces of globalism, the idea of recognizing all cultures and treating them as part of one global civilization, is really just another form of Western nationalism. So today we tend to see nationalism as kind of opposed by globalism. Nationalists say, our country is the greatest, and we should only should only be concerned with the needs of our country, and our aims should be for our country to come out top. That's nationalism. And globalism seems to be an opposite to that. It says, oh no, we shouldn't be narrow nationalists. We should have one world that brings all cultures and all peoples and treats them equally. He says, but actually, it's really just a form of Romano-Germanic nationalism. So it's just a form of nationalism, but on a bigger scale, because global institutions like the United Nations have what they call universal values that they want to spread around the world. But those values have really been shaped by Western thinkers and Western governments. And so they really reflect Western values. And so they're trying to impose a set of values that are ultimately derived from Romano-Germanic civilization on many other peoples around the world who belong to different civilizations that do not share those values. So globalism is just a larger form of nationalism, or we could say it's a Romano-Germanic form of nationalism. So he says that attempts to globalize the world and to create a cosmopolitan one world society are actually just crushing all the other civilizations underneath this Western model.